Praise God. Give thanks to the Father in all that you say and do. Well, amen. Amen. Sing glory, hallelujah.
This is Ben May, and I want to thank you for being with us as we continue to seek the old past. We'll be starting in Exodus chapter 7, and we'll go through chapter 13, although we won't look at everything in those chapters, but we'll use most of those chapters. And also in your study guide, it'll be on page 20. We'll be covering pages 20 through 31. As I said before, this will be a very abbreviated study of these chapters, but we just sort of want to hit the highlights and give us a good feel for what is going on in these books of the Bible. Now, last time, just to sort of catch us up a little bit, last time we talked about how that in the book of Genesis, that as that book closes, that Joseph is saying to his brethren that one day God would visit them and would bring them back to the land that he promised to give to Abraham. Now we skip forward in time now as we open up the book of Exodus. And what we find is that there arose a Pharaoh that did not know Joseph, and he was so afraid of the children of Israel that he put them in bondage, into slavery. Now what happened was that God blessed them. They came into the land of Egypt toward the end of Genesis with about 70 people. And now they are just maybe over 1 million to 2, even 3 million by some estimates in size. And we saw that God called Moses out of that burning bush, remember. And he said to Moses, I want you to go back to Egypt. Moses had fled Egypt, and we talked about that story. And now God says, I want you to go back to Egypt, and I want you to bring my people out of there. I want you to go to Pharaoh and say, let my people go. And after much persuasion, God gets Moses to do that very thing. And so he returns to Egypt, and God had given Moses some signs to perform for the elders of Israel and for Pharaoh. Moses' brother Aaron is accompanying him to be his mouthpiece, you might say, his spokesman. And so they go to Pharaoh, and they say to Pharaoh that God has said to let the people go, that they might sacrifice to him in the wilderness. Well, Pharaoh is not impressed by this at all. And he says, who is this God that I should listen to him? And so we find that Pharaoh makes it even harder for the children of Israel. And then Moses and Aaron go back to Pharaoh, and they perform the signs that God had given them to perform. But Pharaoh doesn't listen to it. Now God had already told Pharaoh, remember, that he's not going to listen to you. In fact, God knew that, and the Bible would express it in a way that would say God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Well, God used circumstances to do that. God didn't make Pharaoh do anything. God never overrules your will. You have the free will to do right or to do wrong. But God can use circumstances and situations and, in a sense, harden our hearts, because God knows if I do this, here's what they're going to do. And that's how it was with Pharaoh. And so God has already told Moses, now Pharaoh is not going to listen to you, and here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to send plagues upon Egypt, and they will know who I am, that I am God. And he's going to do that. And he says, now Pharaoh still is not going to let them go until I send the last plague, which would be the death of the firstborn of all Egypt. And so God is going to do just that. He's going to send 10 plagues. Now let me just briefly go over, just sort of go down the list of these, and then we will go over each one again very briefly. But here's what we're going to see. Moses and Aaron, through God, God doing it through Moses and Aaron, I probably should say, they're going to turn the water to blood. And then frogs are going to come upon the land, and then lice, and then flies, and then murrain of cattle, which is a disease or an epidemic. And then boils are going to come up on man and beast, and hail is going to come down, and then locusts are going to consume the crops. And then darkness is going to come like they have never known before. And then last of all, the death of the firstborn will happen throughout the land of Egypt. Now, there's a reason that God is doing this. How is it that the children of Israel are just going to be allowed to leave when they are in bondage by the most powerful nation of its day. God's going to take care of that. And so in Numbers chapter 33, sort of going forward a bit, Numbers chapter 33 and verse 4, speaking back of these events, it says, "For the Egyptians were burying all their firstborn, whom the Lord had killed among them. Also, on their gods the Lord had executed judgments." And that's what I want to stress this time, I guess, and as we study. That God, not only is He going to bring His people out, He's going to show that He is God. And all these false gods that the Egyptians worship are no match to the Almighty, because in actuality there are none of those gods. In Exodus chapter 18 and verse 11, when Moses is talking with his father-in-law Jethro, here's what Jethro says: "Now I know that the Lord is greater than all the gods, for in everything in which they behave proudly, He was above them." Jethro was not a worshiper only of God. He evidently was a worshiper of many gods. He believed in them. He may think some are more powerful than others. And so the conclusion is there is no God like God. And that's what we want to see now as we see these 10 plagues that God is going to bring down upon the land of Egypt. Now let's start with Pharaoh. We said now that God is going to execute His judgment on all their gods to show that there is no God like Him. As you read in history about the pharaohs of Egypt, these pharaohs believed that they ruled by divine right, and not only divine right, but even divine birth. The pharaohs thought that they too were gods. Now they would claim to be the son of Ammon, Ra. Ra, as we will see in a few minutes, is the sun god. And so they would wear this very elaborate decorative headdress. And on the head would be a falcon, the symbol of Horus. And they'd have something from the tribe of Horus, and a token of that tribe on his forehead, and he have the sign of a serpent there to showing wisdom and life. And the king, Pharaoh, was the chief priest of their faith, and he'd lead all these elaborate processions along. And he would just, again, claim to be a god. Now, if Pharaoh is a god, and they serve all these false gods, surely they can overcome anything that Moses, as they would look at Moses, might call down upon them. And so let's see that. And so the very first thing that God says to Moses, as he's about now to start the first plague, he says in Exodus chapter 4 and verse 17, and he would repeat this all through these plagues, he would say, "You shall take this rod in your hand with which you shall do the signs." And so we'll notice when it's mentioned, it doesn't mention every time that Moses took the rod, but here's that rod that earlier God had said to Moses, "What is that in your hand?" He said, "A rod. Take that rod, throw it down," and it became a serpent. Remember, that same rod Moses was used just as a symbol of power, I suppose you could say. The rod had no power. The power, of course, was from God. Now, what Moses was to do then. In Pharaoh's sight, he goes and he holds that rod out, and sure enough, the water of the Nile is turned to blood. Well, then lo and behold, their magicians come along, and they do the same thing. Now, I don't know if they literally did it, or God just maybe allowed it to happen, or they just fooled the people into think they had done it, but in any event, they thought the magicians had done that. And so that hardened Pharaoh's heart. And then the Egyptians, they would go out and they dig and find water in other places to sort of get around that problem. But the critics, though, now, the critics come along and they say, there are times that the Nile turns red. It's an algae that forms and all that. Well, and even the fish sometimes will die. Here the water turned red, the fish died. But also, not only did the water turn red and the fish die, but even the water in the wells and the water in the pots turned red. That never happened before. And so God is showing His power. But now they had a god. The Egyptians worshipped a god called Hapi or Hapi. And he was the god of the Nile. They actually worshipped the Nile. And here the Nile had been turned red. Where was their God? Where was Hapi? Why didn't he do something about this and turn the water back to the way that it ought to be? Now here you can see a representation of what this God supposedly looked like. God's showing his power over this false god, isn't he? Well, then, after that, and Pharaoh hardened his heart. He wouldn't let the people go. And so in Exodus chapter 8, we find the next plague is going to be the one about the frogs. And so in Exodus chapter 8, the Lord spoke to Moses, say to Aaron, stretch out your hand with your rod over the streams, over the rivers, and over the ponds, and cause frogs to come upon the land of Egypt. Now you just think about that. How would you like to get up in the morning, you start to put your slippers on, and there's frogs in there. You ladies, you open up your oven and frogs are hopping out and such. That's the way they were everywhere. But now usually in the culture of the Egyptians, seeing a lot of frogs was thought to be a good sign, like of good luck and that sort of thing. And they had a god, I'm not really sure how to pronounce the name, it's Heqt. They had the god of that had the head of a frog. In fact, here is a relief of that was found. And you can see it's a strange looking thing. They're not really sure. The head doesn't look quite like a frog, but he was the god of the frogs, represented by a frog. And here now, all these frogs. And they were just everywhere. And finally, Pharaoh asked Moses, please take these away. And Pharaoh is even allowed the timing of that. Well, you just tell me, Pharaoh, when do you want these frogs to be gone? And Pharaoh says, tomorrow. And so Moses, of course, talks to God. And sure enough, the next day, the frogs die out. And in fact, they're just piled up in heaps, and the whole land is just stinking because of the frogs. But again, Pharaoh doesn't do what he says that he would do. He doesn't let the people go. And by the way, their magicians, again, they could replicate the miracle by some way, but they couldn't get rid of them. Again, God is showing his power over even the gods that they would worship. Well then, because that Pharaoh hardened his heart, didn't keep his word, we go to Exodus chapter 8, starting at verse 16. So the Lord said to Moses, say to Aaron, stretch out your rod and strike the dust of the land so that it may become lice throughout all the land of Egypt. Can you imagine that? Lice just everywhere. Not sure just what that is. The original word means biting insect. Well, this time the magicians could not replicate that particular miracle, and they said, this is the finger of God. This is God's doing. But again, Pharaoh, he hardens his heart. He doesn't want to let the people go. In fact, he doesn't even speak to Moses. And so we find then that, well, because they didn't do that. Now, by the way, before we leave that, let me show you this picture of this god. To give you an idea of what the Egyptians would have in mind when they think about their god Heper or Keper. He's the god of beetles and flies. And you'll notice on the head there of this supposedly god, there is a beetle. And so some think, well, maybe it was beetles, and some fly, but whatever it was a biting insect. And that had to be the biggest nuisance you could probably think of. But again, Pharaoh's heart is hardened. He doesn't let the people go. And so what is going to come next? Well, this time God's going to do a little something different. The flies now are going to be the next plague. It's the plague of flies, and they warned Pharaoh about this. But Pharaoh's not with Moses when it actually is brought about. Now, again, magicians couldn't replicate this, and as far as we know, they didn't even try. Well, this time, as we said, this will be something a little bit different. In Exodus chapter 8, starting at verse 20, we find this plague. And it says, and in that day, God says, I will set apart the land of Goshen, in which my people dwell, that no swarms of flies shall be there, in order that you may know that I am the Lord in the midst of the land. I will make a difference between my people and your people. Tomorrow this sign shall be. You see what God is doing? There are going to be flies, but not in Goshen where the children of Israel live. Now, the two most likely culprits for this, the insects, could be what they call dog flies, or again, could be beetles. It's hard to know from the language. Either one would be something you would not want to deal with. That same God, Keper, Kheper, would be the one that would be tied to this. Where is that God? Why doesn't that God that they worship, why doesn't he rid them of this plague? Of course, we know, because there is no such thing. But in the Egyptian mind, it was. And in Pharaoh's mind, why couldn't their God overcome the God of Israel? Well, again, this was the first plague that made a distinction between the Egyptians and the Israelites. And sometimes you wonder, well, why didn't God make a distinction with the other plagues? But keep in mind that God's people needed to learn the lessons about God's strength. And as we follow the story along, they have to be reminded over and over. Don't you remember what God did in Egypt? They needed to learn those lessons themselves. And then God also shows his ability to punish the wicked and keep the righteous safe. As we see now, as the Egyptians suffer with these last few plagues, but not the children of Israel. Well, of course, again, Pharaoh hardens his heart. He doesn't let the people go, as he claims that he will at times. Again, Pharaoh says, okay, let me tell you what's going to happen if you don't let the people go. There's going to be a disease, a pestilence come upon even the livestock. Well, this time there was the murrain, M-U-R-R-A-I-N, murrain, your version may say. It just means disease or epidemic. And there were other diseases or epidemics at various times in the Egyptian culture, but not one that they were told, here's what's going to happen, here's when it's going to happen, and here's who's going to be affected by it. Because again, the children of Israel, their cattle were not affected at all by this. God showing, of course, that he was in control. He protected his people. Now, the particular god that this would be against in the Egyptian mind was the god Apis, A-P-I-S, the sacred bull. This would be one of their more well-known gods, highly respected. They had a lot of gods, but this would be one of the stronger of those, they would think. I'll show you this representation of that. Pretty much like you think a bull might look, with a little artistic liberty given to it, except for that ornate thing on its head there. And so, where was that? Where was Apis? Where was his protection over the Egyptians? They worshipped him, served him in some way. No, there was no overruling God. Excuse me. Well, then, that didn't work. Pharaoh still hardened his heart, wouldn't do what he said. And so now, the boils are going to be sent as a plague. In Exodus chapter 9, and starting at verse 8, then they took ashes from the furnace and stood before Pharaoh. And Moses scattered them toward the heaven, and they caused boils that break out in sores on man and beast. Can you imagine that scene? Here's Pharaoh, and here's his magicians. And Moses takes some ashes and throws it up in the air, and it just scatters, and just boils are breaking out. Well, once again, even though the Egyptians, they couldn't stand before that, but they were not able to convince Pharaoh that they should listen. The God that they would serve, that should have been able to cure them of these boils that were miraculously put on them by the God of heaven, that God would be Imhotep. That's I-M-H-O-T-E-P, Imhotep. He was the physician God, and then there was another God called Thoth, T-H-O-T-H. He was the God of magic and healing. Why couldn't those gods step in now and heal those boils that were on man and beast? And so you see how God is executing judgment on these false gods that they would put so much confidence in, and Pharaoh himself would put confidence in. Well, again, Pharaoh hardens his heart. He doesn't do what he says he'll do. He doesn't listen at times. At times he offers compromises. Why don't you do this? Oh, I've sinned. And then his heart is hardened. Sometimes it doesn't show any penitence on his part. And so God said, well, here comes the next plague. In Exodus chapter 9, the plague of the hail is going to come. Well, Pharaoh and his servants are warned, this hail is coming. And if you fear God, you better get everything in, get your livestock in, get your servants in, because if you're caught outside, you're going to be killed. And so it says in Exodus chapter 9 and verse 23, and Moses stretched out his rod, there's that rod again, stretched out his rod toward heaven. And the Lord sent thunder and hail, and fire darted to the ground, and the Lord rained hail on the land of Egypt. Why, they were terrified. One thing, they didn't see a lot of rain. I've read anywhere from 8 inches of rain a year to some places down as low as 2 inches. And here it's raining, it's hailing, it's lightning, it's thundering, and they took that thunder to be the voice of God. And so they want this gone. And Pharaoh admits that he has sinned and just asks this to stop. Well, we find that some of the Egyptian people even listened to Moses, and they brought their servants and their livestock in, but others, of course, were like Pharaoh, with a hard heart, and they didn't. And so some were killed, some were spared. And now Pharaoh finally says, I've done wrong, just please get this to stop. Well, they had a god that Pharaoh, no doubt, would have called to. This goddess is called Nut, N-U-T. And here is a depiction, and their idea of this was she was the sky goddess, and they imagined her body as the sky being her body, and all the earth, on the earth dwelling up under it. And here's one of the representations of that. Well, again, they might have called to this God, but to no avail, of course. God is executing judgment. He is slowly, one piece at a time, taking down all their gods, so-called gods. Well, again, though, Pharaoh doesn't do what he says he'll do, and God says, okay. Here's what's going to happen. There's going to be locusts come. Well, they'd seen locusts before. Well, not like this. The crops are about to be destroyed. The livestock, they were afflicted. Then the hail came. Well, what crops might have been up at that particular time would have been severely damaged or destroyed. Well, if that was not bad enough, now God's going to send locusts. And so in Exodus chapter 10 and verse 3, so Moses and Aaron came into Pharaoh and said to him, thus says the Lord God of the Hebrews, how long will you refuse to humble yourself before me? Let my people go that they may serve me. Again, Pharaoh won't listen. And so we find in verse 13 of Exodus chapter 10, so Moses stretched out his rod over the land of Egypt, and the Lord brought an east wind on the land all that day and all that night. And then the next morning, the east wind brought the locust. And they had never seen anything like it. Had never seen that many. Well, they had a god, a false god, of course, named Seth. He was the god of crops. Here is a representation of Seth. Why couldn't Seth get rid of these locusts? There was complete devastation. That year's harvest was gone. If it was at a certain stage, as the Bible points out as you read through there, it was gone. Now that hit them hard. Well, still again, Pharaoh hardens his heart. He won't do what he said. So, without warning, because of Pharaoh's hard heart. In Exodus chapter 10 and verse 21, the Lord said to Moses, stretch out your hand toward heaven, that there may be darkness over the land of Egypt. Darkness which may even be felt. Can you imagine something that dark? So dark, it said you could feel it. Now that's sort of an exaggerated figure of speech, I'm sure. But for some reason, they could not generate light. Except in the land of Goshen. The Israelites had light in their dwellings. Well, in Exodus chapter 10 and verse 27, but the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let them go. Then Pharaoh said to him, get away from me. Take heed to yourself. If you see my face, take heed to yourself and see my face no more. For in the day you see my face, you shall die. You have to be careful when you're reading that passage to realize as you read in Exodus chapter 10, verse 27, 28, it's going to go in and supply some more information. And then it's going to show Moses talking to Pharaoh again. And what's happening is really all the same time, same conversation. Because Moses does not see Pharaoh's face again, but he pronounces to Pharaoh the next curse that's coming up. So don't let that sort of confuse you as you're reading through that. Well, again, this darkness. Where was Ra? Where was the sun god Ra? Remember, Pharaoh wore the symbol of Ra on his head to show that he was a descendant. He was deity himself. Here's a representation of Ra. Had that falcon's head, had some of the serpent there. And well, why couldn't they call it Ra? It's dark. So dark it could be felt. And yet their god, Ra, could do nothing about it. Well, now it comes time for the last plague, and God had already said it's going to come down to this. He had told him from the beginning, this is going to be it, the death of the firstborn. Then Moses said, in Exodus chapter 11 and verse 4, Then Moses said, Thus says the Lord, about midnight I will go out into the midst of Egypt, and all the firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die. From the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on the throne, even to the firstborn of the female servant who is behind the handmill, and all the firstborn of the animals, all will die. Who's attacked that? What God is attacked? Pharaoh himself is attacked with this one. God is bringing the ultimate plague now down upon the land of Egypt, and God has already told Moses, then they will let you go. In fact, then they will drive you out. And that's exactly what's going to happen. Egypt had suffered during the first 9, but this 10th plague brought such great loss. But God makes provisions to protect Israel. Remember, starting at about the 4th plague, God makes a distinction between the land of Goshen, where the Israelites are, and the Egyptians. And so it is this time. Before, God just did it. This time, the Egyptians have to make preparation. And it's the preparation that they make will be celebrated throughout their generations, and it'll be called the Passover. So on the 14th day of the month, an unblemished lamb was to be killed without spot, without blemish. The blood of that lamb was to be put on the doorpost of the home. And then it was to be eaten, roasted, not boiled, not raw, of course. Roast it, eat it quickly, they were told. They would be told to have their clothes on, their staff in their hand, eat it with bitter herbs, with unleavened bread, because this all came about so quickly. And so in Exodus chapter 12 and verse 12, the Lord said, For I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night, and will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. Now the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. When I see the blood, I will pass over you. And the plague shall not destroy you, shall not be on you to destroy you, when I strike the land of Egypt. And it came to pass at midnight that the Lord struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on the throne to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and the firstborn of the livestock. So Pharaoh rose in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where there was not one dead. And so much could be said about the Passover. Now let me quickly mention a few things. From this point forward, the firstborn would belong to God. The firstborn of Egypt, they were killed. And now in a very special way, the firstborn of everything for the Israelites would belong to God. And we'll point that out as we continue. But now, I want us to notice about our Lord, about how He ties into this we call the Passover. 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 7. Therefore, purge out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, since you truly are unleavened. For indeed Christ, our Passover, was sacrificed for us. They were spared because the death angel would see the blood on the doorpost and would pass over them. We are spared when the blood of Christ has been applied, spiritually speaking, to us. And our sins are passed over, you might say. It's a wonderful, wonderful illustration, and maybe we'll talk more about that the next time. Thank you for being with us. Be with us as we continue our study in the next section of our workbook. If you haven't ordered that yet, I encourage you to do so. And we'll look forward to studying now how they are going to leave Egypt on their way to the Promised Land.